Welcome. My name is Amy Amoroso. I'm Development Director for the Sky Island Alliance. Also joining me from Sky Island Alliance is Rick Mick, our communications staff, and he will be in the background. Just want to note to attendees that this coffee break is being recorded currently, and we will be muting everyone prior to starting. So please be mindful of background sounds and muting yourself. Welcome to those coming in. Just chat to us where you're beaming in from. We'd love to know. The concept of our virtual coffee break is to bring everyone closer to nature in the Sky Island region and to also learn about latest discoveries in conservation science, stewardship, and adjacent. And today we are excited to have Dr. Sybil Francis and Ian Dowdy from the Center of Future Arizona sharing results from their groundbreaking Gallup Arizona Project and illuminating where Arizonans agree and shared appreciation, concern, and aspirations for our air, land, water, and wildlife. We have a few things to cover before we get to the presentation, so bear with me. We will also have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And if you do have questions, please enter them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end in a moderated discussion. I'd like to let everyone know that the Sky Island Alliance office is in Tucson on the land of the Tohono O'odham, Pascua Yaqui, and other indigenous peoples. Our work throughout the Sky Island region on both sides of the US-Mexico border takes place on indigenous land. At Sky Island Alliance, we acknowledge the lack of truth and reconciliation with Native nations, and our organization is committed to continuing to educate ourselves about this process and mobilizing to stand in solidarity with present-day tribes and support indigenous people who are acting to restore their rights and protect the land we all call home. We are educating ourselves on the indigenous people to whom the land belongs, the history of the land, and indigenous place names and language to better collaborate and support our neighboring Native nations and indigenous peoples. And we invite you to learn more as well. All right, so we can move on to why we're all here today. I would like to welcome both Sybil Francis and Ian Dowdy from the Center of the Future of Arizona. And I will say this has been a long time coming to get this presentation together. I saw Dr. Sybil Francis present several months ago, and I was so enthralled with what a positive message she brings to the table, backed by data. And we are thrilled to illuminate that to our supporters today. So Sybil Francis is the co-founder of the nonprofit Nonpartisan Center for Future Arizona and is currently chair, president, and CEO. And Ian Dowdy also joins us, who is the director of strategic data initiatives and at the Center for Future Arizona and is an urban planner with a diverse background across public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. Welcome to you both, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Amy. I am so thrilled that we made this happen and appreciate your interest in what we do and our message. And I'm really thrilled to be with you this morning. As you mentioned, both Ian and I come from an organization called Center for the Future of Arizona, a nonprofit organization committed to creating a stronger and brighter future for our state. So today, I know that you're very interested in and passionate about environmental issues, as am I. I started my career decades ago, I will say, back in Washington, D.C. as a congressional staffer working on environmental issues, things like the Clean Air Act, funding for the Environmental Protection Agency, amendments to the Clean Air Act back then. And I know Ian is also passionate about environmental issues. Having said that, our portfolio of work at Center for the Future of Arizona is very broad. It's really about all of Arizona and how do we get our arms around this idea of advancing a stronger and brighter future for our state. So I do want to give some context to the data that we're going to share. Ian's going to be sharing data about our public opinion survey research on environmental issues. But I think it's important to put that into perspective. Why is it that we at Center for the Future of Arizona have that data as well as data on other issues that we rely on? And in many ways, it really has to do with the fact that we decided long ago that it really wasn't up to us, as smart as we might be, as the leaders of this organization, to talk about what's important to the future of our state, but we really thought it was very important to go to Arizonans and to ask them that. And also to be clear, I know you all are devoted to this Sky Island area, which is one of my favorite areas of Arizona. I absolutely love it. We're not an environmental organization, and that in many ways, I think, gives us a certain perspective and possibly a valuable kind of other voice to add to environmental issues because we can speak with authority about what Arizonans believe and think, and others can see us as bringing that to the table and not necessarily having a particular agenda. And I think it's always helpful to have different kinds of voices at the table. So with that kind of general introduction, I'm going to bring up my slides and start going into the presentation. So the first part is going to be really introducing who we are as an organization and our public opinion survey research. Ian will share our environmental data, and then I'll kind of help wrap things up, and we'll then do some Q&A. So I will share my screen here just a moment. Okay. All right, well, that didn't work. I was just flashing back this morning on some of the anxieties in the early part of the pandemic and realizing that, sometimes that still raises its head. So let me see, I've got my slide up there. I know I can do this. Okay, share my screen. Where is that? There we go, share. There we go. Okay, now I just need to get rid of that view on the side for you. And there we are. Okay, so our mission is to advance what we call the Arizona we want. And as I mentioned, we're a nonprofit organization. And so I will just go on. So our mission is to bring Arizonans together to create a stronger and brighter future for our state. And we advance what we call the Arizona we want. And I'll talk more about how we get to that vision for Arizona's future. But I think I already hinted at it, that we really go to Arizonans to ask them what's important to the future. How we do our work, we conduct public opinion survey research. I mentioned that we partnered with the Gallup organization over 15 years ago and have done 2 major public opinion survey research efforts with that organization, and more recently have partnered with High Ground, an award-winning public opinion survey research firm in Arizona, and I'll speak more about that. We also have developed something that we call the Arizona Progress Meters, which is if we know what Arizonans want for our future, what do the data tell us about how we're doing? So we really have 2 kinds of data: public opinion survey research data, as well as data about what's going on, let's say, in the environment or in education and other areas. As an organization, in addition to kind of putting our arms around this big idea of the Arizona we want and how do we advance our state, we also have what I call our boots on the ground programs, which are our impact initiatives and programs. And I'll touch on those briefly. They're in the areas of education, workforce, and civic engagement. So how do we do our work? We listen to Arizonans very carefully. Public opinion survey research is an important way we do that. Ian and others on our team, as well as I, go around the state, share data that we have about what Arizonans want, share progress meter data, and also have these listening sessions, or we learn quite a lot by talking to groups in Arizona. So we listen to Arizonans to find out what's important to them. We share trusted data about how we're doing. We pride ourselves in being a trusted source of valid, trustworthy information about Arizona. We bring critical issues to public attention based on what we've learned in our listening and research. And then we do have this very active partnerships with communities across the state and leaders to solve public problems. Can everyone hear me okay and see the slides okay? Amy, just give me a thumbs up. We're good. Okay, great.
Yes, we are hearing you and seeing you.
Great, thank you. So I want to talk, just sort of give you a thumbnail sketch of the kind of survey research and reporting that we do, and then we'll dig into some information in a little bit more deeply. So I alluded to Gallup and high ground. So the Gallup survey was the first one we did was in 2009. And then we did a second one in 2020. One reason they're so far apart is they are massive, and they're really focused on what Arizonans care about for our long-term future, let's say a 10-year horizon. So these are not quick and dirty, like what's the temperature of Arizonans on any given issue at the time. It's really fundamental questions about what do Arizonans prioritize and value regarding the future of our state. And so when I say comprehensive, we had 3,500 responses from Arizonans in the Gallup surveys. And one of the reasons we had such large numbers, because if you're familiar with survey research, those are quite large numbers, is it was really important to us to be able to say, yes, we spoke to rural Arizonans. Yes, we spoke to people of all different races and ethnicities, religious perspective, political affiliation, income level, education level, so that we could speak with statistical validity, so that we could really feel confident in our results and sharing those results and saying, this is who Arizonans are, this is what Arizonans care about and what Arizonans want. So really the most comprehensive and representative surveys of their kind for Arizona. One of the things that I'm going to hammer home is that even in 2009, we were extremely struck by the fact that there is huge agreement, as Amy said, alluded to in my previous presentations, huge agreement on big important issues for Arizona. And this really runs very contrary to what we hear every day about polarization and division in our state, not to mention our country. We identified what we call shared public values, 7 shared public values, and you'll see those in a moment. And as I mentioned, and the shared public values are really our areas where there's 70% or more agreement among Arizonans. And you cannot get to 70% without buy-in from a whole huge cross section of people and backgrounds. So those are our 2 major public opinion surveys of all Arizonans. I like to say, and the real data geek here with us is Ian Dowdy, but I also am kind of addicted to data, because once you start learning about what Arizonans think, you just want to learn more and more, especially because I do find it actually rather uplifting about our findings. But we decided in 22 to do something a little different, kind of a tweak on our Gallup Arizona survey, and say, let's survey likely voters in an election year to find out what's really on their minds. The idea being, is what we're hearing from candidates running from political office really the most important things to Arizonans? Let's find that out. And so we were very much informed by our Gallup results about the kinds of questions we wanted to ask about, but the questions are just a little bit more, for lack of a better term, kind of current. What are some of the things being discussed in the current election season? And the idea was really, how can we bring the voices of Arizonans to the table in our public conversations? There's a lot of media coverage. We hear things from the media. We hear things from candidates running for office. How about we put the voices of Arizonans up also for consideration in campaign season? I was really curious what we were going to find, because these were likely voters versus Gallup was kind of a real cross section of everybody in Arizona, whether they were voters or registered or not. So I was really curious, are we going to find something similar, or might we find some differences? Fascinating to realize, again, how much agreement we have on some of these major issues. We created something called the Arizona Voters Agenda. What that is to qualify to be on the Arizona Voters Agenda, we had to have 50% support, strong support across the board, as well as 50% support among Republicans, Democrats, and independent non-affiliated across all age groups. So really the idea being, to win something, it has to be 50%, but we want to make sure it's 50% basically of everyone. Rather than, let's say, lopsided support for an issue like 90% of one party, 10% of the other. The average would be 50%, but that would not qualify to be on what we call the Arizona Voters Agenda. And so one of the things, and are you seeing the whole screen? Because it feels like it's cutting off here a little bit, but so one of the things that really is a theme that has emerged from our work, which is we understand what Arizonans really value and want, what our shared public values are. From our Gallup survey, we understand what they prioritize on the Arizona voters agenda, but we started seeing there's these big gaps between what we hear from Arizonans and what we're actually hearing in our political dialogue and even what our politics are delivering to us. So the big interesting question is why? So that's kind of a big thumbnail sketch of our two areas of research on public opinion survey research. And how do I forward this?
It looks like the screen is cutting off a bit at the bottom, Sybil.
Yeah, I wonder why
So
that happened.
if we can't fix it, if you could just make sure you read the bottom that's cut
Now I'm
off.
trying to, yeah, okay. I think it's not, I think it's just cutting off the thing at the bottom.
Okay.
So I mentioned I'm not going to go too much into the Arizona progress meters, but we have really interesting data on each of these areas that we found. Let me just see what here. Yeah. So if you go to our website, you can click on any of these icons and you can get curated, publicly available, reliable data on how we're doing in each of these areas. So I'll pick education since we're going to focus um, on environment in a moment. I'll just pick another issue. We have tons of data on education in Arizona, how we're performing. But one of the key things about the type of data that we provide is you don't have to wade through a ton of data and kind of try to figure out what's going on your own. We have a selected set of data that can give you a kind of a quick overview. So again, we don't do this alone. We collaborate with partners across the state in each of these areas, including in the environment or natural resources progress meter, to get input from people like who lead organizations like yours and others across the state about what are the important pieces of data that we need to be sharing so that Arizonans better understand how we're doing in these areas. So it makes it a little bit easier to access data and also to use it to inform your own work and decision making, because our fondest hope is that people will take these data and use them for their own edification, but also for decision making and action. So just as an example, and I'm not going to go into great detail here, this is the type of data you could get on our education outcomes in Arizona, because Arizonans care so much about education. You can see on the left are the metrics, and then across the top are one way that we can slice and dice this information. So briefly, I'm going to just share quickly our impact programs. Again, we're not focused on that today, but just so you have a good comprehensive idea of who we are as an organization. We call ourselves a do tank because we think it's important to not only understand what Arizonans want, but to contribute ourselves to achieving the Arizona we want. And we do that in the three areas that I mentioned in education, workforce, and civic engagement. And we have partnerships across the state where we work with educational, with schools and districts, nonprofits, corporate partners on all of these to actually impact the lives of everyday Arizonans every day, but also advance what we call systems change. So in education, how can we redesign our education system for better results? If you have any interest in that, I can certainly tell you more about that at some point, but I'm just going to move on. This is the kind of impact we have, hundreds of thousands of students impacted, teachers, education leaders supported. One of our major programs is school leadership training. We engage with communities across the state and have lots and lots of partners all across the state. So now let me just share a few insights overall from our Gallup surveys and other work, and then I'll turn it over to Ian for our environmental work. So as I already said, we were kind of blown away by the level of agreement that we found in all our surveys, frankly, on big issues like education, jobs, the environment, healthcare, immigration, and others. And in fact, as I mentioned, we identified what we call 7 shared public values in our most recent survey in 2020. And that's defined as where we have 70% or more agreement among Arizonans about what's important to the future of our state. So as I said, it has to be very comprehensive across geography, income, education level, political affiliation, race, or ethnicity. And so this has been very encouraging to me, certainly, to know this. So those are our 7 shared public values. And this is a little bit more of a kind of the tagline for each of them. So for example, in education, a highly educated and skilled population, affordable healthcare that covers pre-existing conditions in health and well-being, and on down the line. And we will get to environment and sustainable future momentarily. One of the things before we do that, let me just go back to this. One of the things before we do that, I just wanted to acknowledge something that might feel like you're feeling some cognitive dissonance in what I'm sharing, because I often get this reaction, which is, how is it possible that we really have these kinds of levels of agreement? Because in my everyday life, I'm hearing, these very polarizing comments or experiencing pushback on things that I care about, or if you're in the field on the ground trying to work on environmental issues, you might think I keep running into barriers and all this kind of thing. I don't want to deny that experience that you might have or that reaction that you might have, but these data, as I said, are extremely powerful. And they really do get at the root of what I think we are and stand for as Arizonans. And I can tell you, I often share, I moved here 22 years ago. I love this state when I moved here, the natural beauty, the environmental, how spectacular it is. I have become more of an optimist and more in love with Arizona and Arizonans since we started doing the survey research, because we have found it over and over the same thing. It's not like a one-shot deal. We had 2 massive surveys with Gallup. We've done multiple surveys with High Ground during election seasons. Now, the problem is, of course, how do we translate those realities into those insights and core beliefs, shared public values into reality? That's a much more complicated process. We have a certain way that we elect our leaders. We have very partisan primaries. We have gerrymandering. We have money in politics. We have misinformation. We have all sorts of things that kind of get in the way of translating those ideals of Arizonans into reality. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and just hope that you will open your mind if that's your reaction to the fact that we really do have very solid evidence of the kinds of things that we're going to share with you. So with that, I'm going to turn over the presentation of the environmental data to Ian Dowdy, our Director of Strategic Data Initiatives, otherwise known as our in-house data geek, and also a very passionate environmental person in terms of caring about Arizona's environment. So Ian, you were going to do a forks up for me when I change the slides for you. I'm sorry, because I'm the one controlling the advance. So we will do that, and I will start right now, Ian.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure this group would love a forks up every time we change the slides. It is game day for ASU, by the way, tonight. So some of you, I know many of you are Southern Arizona folks and are rooting for your U of A Wildcats and in your own games. I think this week, I would guess. So good luck to that, and maybe you can root for ASU tonight as well. So I do want to talk a little bit about environment and sustainable future, the data that we have. Sybil did a fantastic job with kind of the background. What is it that brings Arizonans together? Where are we getting our data? What are the types of things that we're concerned about? I'm going to be sharing with you some specific insights from the Gallup Arizona survey and also from the Arizona Voters Agenda. And many of you know that I've worked in environmental policy and conservation work for a good number of years. This is a very passionate topic for me. And it's really fun to be re-engaged with the Sky Island Alliance again and to be able to provide this information to this group. And also I offer my own services and CFA services to bring this data and information to you to help inform your work as well. So feel free to continue this conversation. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so as Sybil said, We actually agree on an awful lot of things, particularly things in environment, certainly things around water, certainly things around other types of topics. As Sybil mentioned, for things to make to become a shared public value, it has to have 70% agreement across Arizonans. And as she mentioned, our survey sample size, it was significant. And so we're able to speak with tremendous confidence, not just about Arizonans as a whole, but also look at the different corners of the state and different subgroups as well. So what the simple message is that we agree on a whole lot of things related to advancing environmental policy and sustainability in Arizona. And my very favorite thing is that at the top of this slide, you see that 92% of Arizonans agree that we should preserve and protect Arizona's rivers, natural areas, and wildlife. I think that statement generally encapsulates a lot of what Sky Island Alliance does in southern Arizona, in northern Mexico, a lot of work around conservation, a lot of work around land and water, springs, rivers, things like that. And so you can be happy to know that Arizonans are very supportive of this idea. In fact, this was the #1 supported issue in the Gallup Arizona survey in 2020. Just slightly ahead of having highly qualified teachers and principals in all of our elementary schools. So this is an unbelievable thing that Arizonans love this issue and want to see action on it over the next 10 years. You can also see Arizonans want to work to protect rural water. That's been a big topic recently. As you know, based on these data, it's been something Arizonans will support and have supported over the last several years. Preventing state forest fires, reducing urban heat island, protecting and expanding open space. One thing I love to talk about is this relationship between these different issues. If we look at protecting and expanding open space for parks and outdoor recreation, that was tremendously supported, 82%. But that's 10 points behind the share of Arizonans who want to preserve and protect rivers, natural areas, and wildlife. And so when people say, well, we want to protect land and water for human recreation primarily, I say, well, I'm not sure that the data support that. I think the data actually are really leaning toward protecting land and water for the preservation of our wildlife and our natural heritage. And so this is really incredible information, I think, to support that. Improving air quality, you see a lot of support for that, and also even transitioning to clean energy. Next slide, please. As Sybil mentioned, we don't actually agree with all of these things at the same level across all of Arizona's demographics. And some people would be a little bit skeptical, probably, to see some of these data. But I want to share with you across certain subgroups the amount of support that we have for these sorts of things. This is the same question. How important is it that we preserve and protect Arizona's rivers, natural areas, and wildlife over the next 10 years? If you look across generations on the left, Gen Zers had tremendous support, 96%, and Gen Xers had the lowest support across generations of 90%. Again, tremendous support, over 9 in 10 Arizonans across generations. Even political parties toward the middle, tremendous support, 98% among Democrats, 88% among Republicans. And then even looking across political affiliation, or not political affiliation, but political leanings, or ideology, very liberals, 99% support, very conservatives, 83% support. So lots of support for this particular issue. So as Sky Island Alliance and its partners continue to go out into the landscape and work to preserve and protect Arizona's rivers, natural areas, and wildlife, you can know that there is a lot of support for that action in general. Of course, the challenge is, how do we do it? What are the things people generally support in terms of methods? But if we look at the overall outcome in terms of having these conservation actions happen, I think there is a lot of support for that. Next slide, please. Rural water is something that you all also work in, and there's a lot of work at SIA among rivers and streams, particularly springs. So Arizonans really want to see that rural water supplies are protected. They know that there's a weakness in that area. I'll get to some more data on that in just a second. But if you look at these data, I mentioned that there was, I believe, 86% support for this broadly across the board. And you can see, again, tremendous support across the board. The lowest among the very conservatives even had over 70% support. the highest among, Democrats and Gen Zers. Obviously, lots of support there as well. So protecting rural water supplies is something that's big. And there's been a lot of conversation about that in the legislature and in other arenas recently. And so there's some challenge around figuring out exactly how to do that, but something that Arizonans are concerned about. Next slide. So just to recap, these are data from the Gallup Arizona survey. There are, on this list, there are 7 actions that were specifically approved at 70% or higher by Arizona voters, including preserving and protecting our rivers, natural areas and wildlife, and rural groundwater, and even transitioning to clean energy and things like that. So tremendous amount of support across the board. Next slide, please. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so this is the Arizona Voters Agenda data. Sybil mentioned that to be on the Arizona Voters Agenda, it had to cross 2 thresholds. So any of these topics, if they're specifically policy items, they had to be at 50% or higher strongly agree or support among all Arizona likely voters, and 50% or higher among all age groups, and all political affiliations, including independent and unaffiliated voters. And so we're going to talk through some of this. These are data mostly from our 2022 Gallup Arizona survey. We just finished fielding a new survey, and we'll have new data coming out, I believe, on September 18th. So a week from yesterday, we'll have data coming out on the issues that came out of the 2024 Arizona Voters Agenda in water and environment. So look forward to those. But what the message here is that Arizona voters want to see action on certain issues related to the environment and sustainability. And they want to see our elected officials who are running for office, our candidates, to talk about these issues. So you can see that even among sort of independent and unaffiliated voters, we had tremendous support for these issues. And as we know, in Arizona, about 1/3 of our electorate are independent and unaffiliated voters. So these people matter, even though they don't often participate in the primary elections. 98% of independents say protect water future, 98% say improve air quality, 95% say preserve and protect our rivers, natural areas, and wildlife. We continue to field this question because it has such high support, because it's really a powerful message that Arizonans want to see action on this issue. Next slide. Also, we have a lot of support around issues related to water. So if you look at these 2 data points, again, preserving and protecting rivers, natural areas, and wildlife, 96% of all likely voters support that. You see that's slightly higher than the overall support that we saw in the Gallup Arizona survey for all Arizonans. That includes 93% of Republicans for likely voters. And then in securing our water future and addressing our long-term drought, you see 95% support broadly, including 94% of Republicans and 98% of Democrat likely voters. Next slide. And as often the case, when we hear election dialogue, we don't hear a lot of the issues that we care about talked about. We often hear, as Sybil mentioned, a lot of discussion about the more partisan things that divide us, the sort of wedge issues, as they call them, the things that sort of rally up the base of each party. But Arizonans want to hear what leaders plan to do about our water future. And so 90% of voters say we have to support sustainable practices that protect our air, land, and water and foster a high quality of life. That includes 80% of Republican likely voters and 100% of Democrat likely voters. And if we look at needing to do something to protect our water future, 94% of all voters say that that's important, including 89% of Republicans, 99% of Democrats, and 98% of independents. So something that we can talk about as being important for our election dialogue. Next slide. This is an interesting slide, and one that I think should raise some concern for everyone. We all know that Arizona's water future is much more secure than people think. We know that a lot of the dialogue about water has been negative in recent years. We know we have weaknesses and challenges that need to be addressed, but the perception around our water and how we feel about water matters. And when we asked Arizonans, Arizona likely voters, how you feel about our water situation and if we have enough or will have enough. We found that Arizonans are generally very pessimistic about our water future. So only 18% said that they feel we have enough water for agriculture, residents, industry, and other businesses for the next 100 years. 73% of Arizonans said no. So that's an interesting thing, something to think about. So when we talk about our water future, we need to think about, well, you know, what can we do to improve the public perception and the feelings, the security that we feel? Because our decisions long term about buying homes, about where we live, about where we choose to put down roots matter, especially when we think about our water future. Next slide. I love this slide. We don't share it all often, but I thought this group would really like it. One thing I've always wondered is where would Arizonans prefer to put their water? And I know many in this
And
room.
I don't know whether everyone can see it. I can't see the whole slide. And I don't know how to fix that, but maybe it's just me, but you might want to say what's on the top unless you can see it.
It's looking okay for me, Sybil, but I
Oh,
will
okay.
walk
I guess
through it.
it's just me. Okay, sorry to jump in, but that's fine. Then go ahead.
Oh, you're fine. No worries. I will admit the font is a little small and a little fuzzy. So you know that is a challenge. And as I mentioned, we don't always share this data, but I thought this slide, this group would appreciate it. As you know, we have choices about where we put our water. We can put our water into urban growth. We can put our water into rivers and streams. We know many of our rivers and streams have been dewatered over the years because of our use of that water for urban areas. We know, you know, for example, in Tucson, you all have made fantastic decisions about using reclaimed water and effluent in the Santa Cruz to help that river come back and be restored in certain cases. Those are decisions that communities have to make. And so when we ask this question of which of the following do you think should be the highest priority for our limited water resources, this is what Arizona likely voters said. They said 29% of likely voters said we think we should ensure rivers and natural waterways have enough water to sustain wildlife and recreation. 26% of Arizonans said we should dedicate water to make sure Arizona's population can continue to grow. 27% said we should allocate water to sustain rural agriculture. And 5% said we should focus water toward new employment and industry. And then there was a small amount, about 12% actually, who either didn't know or refused to answer the question. So you can see that Arizonans are generally divided about what to do with the water. And depending on where you live, depends on your priorities and what you think is important. We know that it's important to do, you know, really all of these things are important. And so, you know, in many cases, this is the challenge of leaders to figure out what to do and what works best for their local community. But I thought this group would be happy to see that ensuring rivers and natural waterways have enough water was actually the plurality of this response with 29% support. So I thought that was interesting. Next slide, please. And so just to recap, the items that Arizonans in the 2022 voters agenda said were important and that became topics that were central to our election dialogue. Securing our water future, preserving our rivers, natural areas, and wildlife, increasing investments to prevent forest fires, improving air quality, investing federal funding into environmental and water issues. All of those things were things that Arizonans generally, actually broadly supported, and things that are important to our electorate. Next slide.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to hand it back over to Sybil. Thank you all for your patience. I hope no one fell asleep in the data presentation. It was really nice to share that with you.
Well, as I said, thank you so much, Ian. That was really great. And as I said, hopefully this information you find uplifting. I do want to point out that, not everybody agrees on everything, and we are not sitting here telling all of you that that is the case. What we do is we focus on areas of agreement. And I will say there are very high levels of agreement on environmental issues for sure, but as well, as I mentioned, sometimes how those things get translated into policy is a different matter. One way I like to describe that last slide, that more or less evenly divided between preservation, growth, and agriculture for water, is Arizonans want it all. They think it's all important. And so it's not about trade-offs or reducing things. It's leaders figuring out how do we serve the needs of Arizonans. But we ask ourselves, okay, so we have this wonderful information. How do we move forward to engage more of Arizona and Arizonans in building the Arizona we want? And that's what we really work on every day. And we realize that no single organization or person or agency alone can move the state forward. And that's why we're very much focused on how do we bring Arizonans together to create that stronger and brighter future for our state. And as I said, our hope is that by sharing this information, we can empower others like all of you with knowledge that can inform your discussion, decision-making, and action. And we are also part of that action in our view. One of the things that I do find encouraging, because we did ask Arizonans if they're willing to speak with people of different views to solve problems. Again, in this very polarized and divided political environment, we found that Arizonans actually are much more open than one might think, although they're not necessarily terribly optimistic. Still over a majority that 56% that we can come together to solve those problems. We in our election survey, our Arizona Voters Agenda survey, we asked a number of questions related to how people were feeling about elections and candidates running for office. And we asked, our current candidates for state and legislative offices talking about the issues that are important to you. Only 40% said yes. So this goes back to what Ian alluded to, and I think I said earlier, which is, they're not necessarily addressing these major issues of concern and interest to Arizonans. So the way we do our work is we think we're an important kind of counter narrative, counter voice to this idea of polarization and division. I often say our politics are polarized, but our people are not nearly as polarized. And how can we really focus on where we agree and continue awareness building around this fact that we agree on more than we disagree on the big important issues? We see our role as supporting leaders, the media. We consider the media a major target because where do they get their information? They're getting their information from candidates. They're getting their information from many politically oriented polling. And where those hot button divisive issues are, they are reporting on those kinds of things. So we see the media as a very important target for us in terms of providing them the support and information that can help them provide some more balanced reporting armed with trusted data. And as I said, we also see ourselves and partner with communities and leaders across the state to advance our impact in our focus areas of education, workforce, and civic engagement. So I'm often asked by groups, what can we do? What can they do to take action? I think part of it is, just mulling over this information and what does it mean to you and how can it be useful to you? We're always ready to share this information with other groups. That's why I'm so grateful to have been invited today by Amy, who heard me present at the Arizona Community Foundation gathering, I believe it was last spring. So this is how it works, kind of word of mouth, if you will. And also how to utilize this data to inform discussions, decision-making, and actions leading to policy or other kinds of outcome. We're not just focused on legislative or government leaders, we're focused on leaders of all types across the state and how this can be useful to them. And so are there areas that can be useful to you, data that can be useful to you in your work? And you can further partner with us, certainly following up with me or Ian on any of this information or other ideas you have about how this information could be helpful to you or any other group that you're involved with. So we really focus, as I said, on leaders in terms of sharing this information. The media, I think I already described how important the media are to us. And then, of course, community members and organizations like yours to utilize this data and really be inspired on it to take action. You can go to our website and click on these links to see a lot of data on the Gallup Arizona Project, the Arizona Voters Agenda, as well as the progress meters. And if there's anything you ever wanted to really dig into more deeply, the data we have on our website really scratches the surface. What we call crosstabs is, what do people who report as conservatives who live in this county on this issue say about XYZ issue? So Ian can just slice and dice the data any way you want. And there's some interesting insights in there. So we are at Q&A now, and Amy told me that we should leave the screen up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So for
Great.
during the Q&A, just to give a little bit of privacy to the participants and the questions. So Ian and I are happy. I think, Amy, you were going to
Yeah, I'll just
moderate.
eliminate the questions we have in the chat for you, and then you can both talk about it. First and foremost, thank you so much for for your presentation and your work and the positivity and different perspectives you bring to the discussion. And I'm so glad you took some time today to share with our group. What I'm seeing in the chat is people would, you did share your links, but if it's possible to put links to the places you directed people in the chat, that would be helpful. And then also if you want people to contact you directly, just share how you want people to get in touch with you in the chat. That would be.
So Heather Thornton is our Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. She can put that information in the chat. When I have my screen up, I can't seem to access the chat, so she can provide any contact
She
information.
is doing that right now.
Okay, great. Great.
Great. Okay, perfect. So I'm seeing a question related to mining and the impacts to the water table. Our group has worked with folks in Patagonia. There's active mining operations there and decision making happening with the DEQ and whatnot. Do you have any data that addresses those topics?
Not specifically on mining, but Ian, I might turn over to you if there's anything you can glean from our data relative to that. I mean, I think overall, and again, this may not relate to specific on the ground experiences you all have, but I think overall it's fair to say that Arizonans would want to protect our water in any type of human activity that we would undertake. But I'll turn it over to Ian to see if there's any elaboration on that.
Yeah, thanks, Sybil. Well, we didn't ask people specifically, if for geographic, local challenges. Like in the case of this mine, do you feel like it's better or worse to do that, or are you concerned about groundwater depletion in this particular region? But we can derive from the data that we do have about some of the priorities that Arizonans broadly have. We know that they want to preserve and protect sort of like the rivers, the natural areas, and the wildlife. I would imagine specific impacts that have a demonstrable impact on natural areas, on wildlife and rivers. I think we can say with some confidence that broadly Arizonans would be concerned about that. I think we could also say that in the event that there's activity, whether it's mining or whether it's unwise, maybe agriculture or some other activities that are depleting rural groundwater supplies, we could talk about how Arizonans think it's important that we have sustainable water supplies in rural Arizona. So I think there are some things that you could derive from the data. And as Sybil mentioned, we are able to look, because of the Gallup Arizona Survey's sample size, we are able to sort of isolate certain regions, certainly communities, demographics, in our look at the data, just sort of like isolate areas where these impacts might be more pronounced. So, I'd be happy to talk to folks about that if that would be helpful. I put my email address in the chat because, some of these data might be helpful. But as I said, we haven't surveyed any specific local issue like that. We're really looking at the broader statewide view on these issues for a longer term perspective.
Now, I will jump in and say that we are seriously looking at the possibility of doing a survey specifically on water, because in any of the surveys that we've done, because we cover so many topics, we can also usually only ask a few questions per topic. But because of the importance of water, we're putting serious consideration into doing a survey exclusively focused on water. So one thing you might share with Ian as well is if there are water related questions that you would like to see surveyed, please share them with him. There's no promises, but we are beginning to consult with organizations about the kinds of questions that they would find useful. So that would be a way forward on this sort of thing as well.
Great. Thank you both. And we appreciate your willingness to work with communities around the state to help them find data that supports protection and value water.
I'll do a quick follow-up to my own answer. So for Gallup, for example, I believe we had something like 82 questions. We covered 7 or 8 topics, including immigration, jobs, the environment, education. So you can imagine out of 82 questions, plus, front and back end of the survey, general questions about how Arizonans are feeling about the state and the environment, I mean, the economy and all these sorts of things, that maybe were able to ask 8 or 10 questions max per topic. And if we're trying to cover the environment, you can imagine how that quickly gets used up. So the fact that we aren't able to dig deeply into regionally important, vitally important issues, just to put that into a little bit of context for better understanding, which is another reason why we are thinking about going forward, not only a water survey, starting with a water survey, but potentially digging much deeper into some of these other topic areas.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting to create an anonymous way to collect information from around the state using connections with various natural resources organizations such as Sky Island Alliance, where people are submitting to you questions that they would like to see answers on around water. So that might be a way that you can partner with conservation organizations to just give you a flavor. So as you're developing your questions, the folks can inform what we're interested in knowing.
Well, we could, for example, ask the Sky Island Alliance to collate, collect questions that you and your affiliated individuals would be interested in and package them and send them to us. That would be one approach.
Yeah. We'll chat on that.
Yeah, Ian can be in touch about that.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple more questions coming in the chat. We have a question about breaking down the data to urban, suburban, and rural. Is there a way to do that?
We absolutely,
jump
absolutely.
in.
Yep. And we have done that in many cases on a lot of questions. And you'd be surprised how little of a difference it might make in many cases. But yes, we do that. We can also isolate individual counties or group counties and regions. And obviously this is all dependent on getting an adequate sample size from our analysis, but we can look, in certain regions and break it up into to other groups. So we can do like multivariate analysis as well in certain cases. So yeah, we can. So if you have you're really curious about, what Arizonans in a certain region are saying about a certain thing and maybe how it might break down, please just reach out. I'd love to talk with you.
I know this is one of the most striking things about our data, which is you think, oh, it's going to vary so much by different region. In our first survey, one of the things we noticed first, I mean, this is kind of, joking around a little bit, but, that Phoenicians and Tucsonans agreed on much more than one might think, given the rivalries between the two areas. But seriously, that, and for example, on the heat island question, I was so interested in the fact that, I expected people in urban areas to be concerned about heat, but we found this to be true across the state. So it is surprising to us when we realize how much more we have in common than divides us on many of these big issues.
Great. Yeah. We have another question wanting to know if you have percentages of Indigenous people that were surveyed.
Ian?
Yeah. Great question. So we did oversample for American Indian populations across the state. We do have a representative sample size for that group, and have reported in many cases on those disaggregated data, including in the Gallup Arizona survey report that I think was shared called The Decade Ahead. You can download that from our website. And so yes, we can report with confidence what American Indians broadly in the state have said about issues. Now, we don't have a sample size adequate to isolate any particular tribe or any particular geography, but we can look at statewide at that issue. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Another question, wanting to know, are you sharing this survey data with politicians and legislators?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're a nonpartisan organization, and we are currently ramping up our efforts to share this information more broadly. True confession, I think we were wanted to be so careful for so many years about not being perceived as political that we kind of shied away from that a little bit, but we feel empowered to share this information, educate leaders. So we are doing that, including briefing any candidate running for office who is interested in this information. So, for example, in the last gubernatorial race, I briefed most of the gubernatorial candidates. Not all of them responded to my offer. So we're very careful to make sure that we're even, take an even hand at who we're speaking to. So we speak to both Democrats and Republican leaders in the legislature, congressional representatives, senators, et cetera. But yes, and I will say that, we find that the elected leaders and even candidates running for office find it interesting, but I wouldn't say and I think, especially the statewide offices, I think the gubernatorial candidates did find it interesting. But one thing that I found curious is that to some extent, what the majority of Arizonans think or want is not necessarily what is going to get these leaders elected.
Hmm.
And so this is where my mind started kind of worrying about how is it that we have these gaps between what Arizonans want and what our elected candidates for office and elected leaders are talking about. And I think that we have to ask ourselves that question. And I think that there's many different factors that affect what candidates for, the incentives that candidates for office, the things that they focus on. And certainly, there's been a lot of discussion around, money in politics or gerrymandering. But I think another really important factor is our partisan primary system, which really incentivizes candidates running for office to speak to their base. And, whatever you might think of that, whether you think that's a good system or not, it does, I don't want to use too judgmental a term, but distort, if you will, the outcomes, because the base does not by definition represent the majority of Arizonans. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, that that while elected leaders and candidates running for office are interested in this information, it's not necessarily the insights are not necessarily what are going to get them elected. Now, having said that, our partner in public opinion survey research at High Ground, they will often point out, these are areas, in fact, that if leaders did want to capitalize on it, it could be of benefit to them. So, for example, we find over and over that Arizonans support more funding for education. And yet we don't necessarily find legislators acting on that. Having said that, it would probably be to their benefit to act on it, but they're not necessarily incentivized to act on it, if that makes sense. So I'm sorry that was kind of a long answer, but yes, we do share this information, and the reactions or the kind of cool, interested reactions we've gotten have been very informative to me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So we are at a little after 10:30. I have one more question, and then I think we can wrap things up if you both can stay with us just for a few
Yep.
moments. Okay, great. So we have a question around do you have polling around whether Arizonans have a willingness to pay for preservation of rivers and natural areas? Like, for an example, as a bond measure or other form of taxes.
So, as I mentioned, we have only so many questions, even though we've done multiple surveys, we're covering a lot of topics. So, but this question is one that we often get in general, which is, are Arizonans willing to pay for what's important to them? We have multiple data points on this that I would say are promising. So, for example, we've said to Arizonans, are you willing to pay more in taxes for things that are important to you? And I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head right now, but it's not overwhelming. It's not like 80% of people are saying yes. On the other hand, the numbers that we're getting suggest that if a well-made case for certain issues that matter to Arizonans and to these respondents, that they would support that. So I think in general, Arizonans appreciate our low tax environment, but at the same time, they don't feel overburdened by taxes. And I think, they are open to a case being made to support things that matter to them. Ian, do you think that's a fair generalization? Just kind of.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that our recent survey research indicates that about 2/3 of Arizonans would be willing to pay more in taxes for things that they say are important to them. The question is, what are those things, right? And majorities of Arizonans say that their tax dollars are not going to the right things. So there you go. So I think it's worth exploring. Would they be willing to pay for something that's so popular, which is protecting more open space? I would imagine it's more likely than than spending that money on something that is not very popular. So there you go for an answer.
Great. Great.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your time, your effort, your energy, and listening to what Arizonans want for our future. And I look forward to all the possible connections that come out of this discussion today. There's a lot of love in the chat for the discussion and your work. And we look forward to the future.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be with you. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
It was great. Thanks, everyone.